Hi, I'm Jamie Horton, tonight's host on Geeky Port, a safe harbor in the world of nerddom. Today we're going to tackle the subject of mythology, folklore, and legend. With me is Amie McFarlane.
Hello. How's it going?
Good. Was that too dramatic? That was kind of dramatic.
It was a little dramatic.
I was in character. I don't know what that was all about.
That's host Jamie as opposed to panelist Jamie.
It's true, yeah. Completely different character. It's like Jekyll and Hyde.
That's disturbing.
It's really just Hyde and Hyde. Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's jump into it.
Oh yeah, it's one of my favorite things in the world because I love the anything supernatural, paranormal, mythical, magical. It's my favorite category on Jeopardy, mythology.
Sure.
I actually have a dream of owning a unicorn. I don't care how old I become. That's what I want. But yeah, no, I love anything that involves folklore of supernatural creatures and how different cultures affect those creatures and how we in North America view, a fairy is different than how they would view, fairies and fae folk in Europe and
Sure.
in Africa and in Australia, etc.
Right. It all comes from that particular people's culture, like what it represents to them. Right. Like, for example, like a fairy could be a very helpful creature, like an embodiment of pure goodness. But for, like the Irish, it could be like a mischievous creature that you don't want anywhere near you. Well, there's also different classifications of fairies. There's elves and there's leprechauns and sprites and whatnot. And they all kind of represent a different like general personality.
Yeah.
And what they do for you, if they're to be driven out and destroyed or appeased or sought after. Yeah.
Or just straight up feared.
It's true. Like a goblin or a hobgoblin or a bugbear.
There's some that so these kids, the
kids today.
The kids, the Gen Z generation and their TikTok, they have made Mothman like this big deal. Like everything is about Mothman. Like he's an A-list celebrity now. And I don't know if they all realize that Mothman's like an omen of like misfortune and like often injury.
Okay.
So when you see Mothman, it's not good.
Right. Well, then it's similar to there was a creature from the Harry Potter novels that it's actually like a folkloric hound that like if you see it, like it's already too late. Like there's ill fortune that will befall you.
The black dog.
The black dog.
In the tea reading, yeah.
Yeah. So, and I think that goes back to Irish or Scottish folklore somewhere in the.
I think it actually goes.
Those islands.
I do think it goes further back. I do know it's, I believe, Nordic origin, which honestly they have the best stories.
They really do. Like elves in that particular mythology. Like they have their own realm of existence. And they're not like these little like butterfly winged children or tiny creatures. They're kind of like Tolkien's perception of elves. Like they're like tall and like kind of like the race of mankind before mankind, like a perfected version of them, that kind of thing. It's and I think that's where actually the word elf comes from. Elf, I think, is a Nordic word that from Scandinavian folklore.
You know as much as I do about that.
Okay. I think they're from like Alfheim, I think, is their particular realm.
Oh my gosh. I think my obsession started with Lord of the Rings. Because I can't really think of any, other than Tinkerbell, like anything before that in childhood that would make me care about, Sasquatch and the Loch Ness Monster or anything like that either.
It's interesting what Tolkien did with Lord of the Rings is he took these characters from folklore and fairy tales. Like a hobbit is essentially like a little like dwarfish creature, and of course you have elves and goblins and orcs, and but he didn't make them like he made them the central characters, right? And gave them like this vast lore. Like, before mankind was like the dominant species on Earth, like he shared the world with elves and dwarves and goblins and orcs and wizards and all these other creatures. And in fact, made like a character like Frodo or Bilbo and Samwise, like characters that would be side characters in, say, like a Grimm fairy tale, the protagonists. And like the human characters are just like helping them along.
Yeah, I would say that, especially with Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit and everything, that's probably one of the earliest big things that had all that stuff that wasn't like just, tales you passed down from generation to generation.
Right.
That was the first, like, this is a fiction work that I came up with this magical world building thing. And I kind of love like everything that came more or less from that. Controversy aside, with everything with Harry Potter, and then everything that came from just comic books as well, because especially DC Comics, they have a lot of just, mythical creatures or mythical beings and characters that they decided to just make characters, make human, make whatever. For instance, the entire story of Thor is based off of Nordic mythology.
Right.
So, and then also in DC is Raven from Teen Titans, who follows, it's like the demon lore and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's interesting that like, well, even Tolkien didn't really like invent anything. He just kind of like defined it. Like, like Snow White has 7 dwarf companions, but like dwarves in like Nordic folklore and Tolkien, like they were these subterranean miners, that would like, have these vast like cavernous fortresses like within a mountain itself. And so like, and even that becomes an influence for things like Dungeons and Dragons, modern video game role-playing games. And it's interesting how like just one builds off of another.
Speaking of Dungeons and Dragons, a certain someone is very involved in that game, and I have never played.
Right.
But that certain someone has not so subtly hinted to me that I should play by buying me dice.
That was me.
Yeah,
that was me.
That was you.
I bought Amie her first set of Dungeons and Dragons polyhedral dice. I guess all dice are, by their very nature, polyhedral.
Unless you draw one.
It's a D1 one.
I feel like that's just like a coin.
Oh yeah.
You just flip a coin.
That's interesting. Maybe we can get into role playing next. But what I really think we can explore before we take a break is kind of like folklore and mythology that still fascinates us to this day. Because you brought up Mothman before. So Mothman isn't like a mythological creature. He is a cryptid.
Yeah.
So let's explore that.
So cryptids are, I wish I knew the definition, but the examples would be the Loch Ness Monster or Nessie, Yeti, Sasquatch, Bigfoot, which are all the same thing, just depending on where you are. Mothman's another one. There are a lot of creatures that became cryptids, even though they didn't originate as that, like things like trolls. But like versions of trolls became, this is now a cryptid. And they usually are either omens or seem usually like the cause of certain natural happenings.
Okay.
So like there are some that they say the trees, you know, if you see like a part in trees and they're like arched naturally, that's because, you know, this cryptid leaned against it or something.
Interesting.
And like them walking through the woods is how that happened. They created these natural paths because, you know, things are growing in their way, they just keep going.
Well, that's interesting too, because there's really not a lot of proof other than statues and carvings and bas reliefs of like
Blurry
mythological
photos.
creatures. Right, but like cryptids actually like have like physical evidence. Like this is the footstep of Bigfoot. This is a blurry photograph I took of the Mothman or Nessie or Champy. Is that the Nessie of Lake Champlain?
Sure.
Yeah, like a plesiosaur type of dinosaur. Yeah.
That's what, and they're often usually based off of real things that have happened in evolution. Like Bigfoot's based off of, you know, Neanderthals and like.
Or Gigantopithecus.
Nerd.
That's what the largest of the hominids.
Oh, wow. Yeah. That's cool. But like, you know, and things like that, or like if, you know, when we evolved from the apes, if it didn't happen quite the same way, it becomes Bigfoot and stuff like that. So I feel like often cryptids are a little more scientific than mythical creatures or like
even though it could all be bunk,
creatures.
But it's it's fascinating. It becomes a kind of like quasi-scientific study where it's just like you can meet with other people. They even have like, you know, gatherings of, not like Juggalo gatherings, but like gatherings of like these, you know, like armchair scientists and comparing all the evidence that they have. And like they'll write books about it, and articles online, and try to piece together, you know, what this creature could be. I mean, like UFO conventions, like suddenly we now know that like most aliens look like grays. They're yay high and they're bald and they've got these big ovular eyes and a tiny slit for a mouth. And like we've just decided, because, you know, so many people have like related all these stories, you know, true or not, that's what a typical extraterrestrial creature looks like.
Everything's based off mass hallucinations. But yeah, no, that's one of my favorite differential things is if you believe in the Loch Ness Monster, people might side-eye you, but like, you know, whatever. They'll just kind of like be like, oh, you're so quirky. But if you're like, no, fairies are real, I saw one. They're like, okay, so these nice men in white coats are coming. So it is interesting to see how, even though essentially they are the same thing, we as a society decide one thing is normal and one thing is not.
The power of belief. Yeah, and let's explore that right after this important break.
Someone want to give me a room, huh? How about room service? Just need a stupid goddamn phone.
So now, you say you found something out there. You were saying?
Just a small farm. I don't even know if they own the place, but they came at me. And
let's just get him in the truck.
and then what?
You're not going to take him into town, are you?
Hey, you didn't happen to see a guy out there, did you? On your nature hike? He might have had a slight injury to the head.
You did that to him, huh? Beat him up like that?
You don't know what I know.
That damn farm. There's something happening here, and I don't know what it means. There's something wrong.
There's a shit storm coming our way.
Kidding. You serious? These people seem so... what's the word? Normal?
There's 250,000 ways to skin a cat. That's what public service is all about. We'll make this whole town a sacrifice.
Welcome back. As always, I am Jamie, and today I'm your host for Geeky Port, a safe harbor in the world of geekdom. And Amie Lee, of course, is here with me, and we are discussing mythology, legend, and folklore.
Yeah. I think that's the order we have been
I
saying.
said something. So yeah, we were talking about the difference between mythological creatures and cryptids.
Yes.
Cryptids are real, and mythological creatures are not, which is an interesting point,
Sure.
right? Like no one says like, no one thinks like dragons are still real, right? But people will say like, oh well, of course there's a, surviving plesiosaur in this lake.
Absolutely. In this landlocked water fixture,
Yeah.
there's definitely something in there that's not just turtles. But yeah, the fact that, I mean, obviously, there are going to be people who are going to look at you weird because you think something like a cryptid is real, but there's a science to it, and there are people who have doctorates in this stuff, and there are people who have doctorates in folklore, but it's like in the sense of like preserving culture,
Right.
as opposed to with cryptids, it's like these things are real. Let's get them into like our brains as like there really is a 6-foot moth male hybrid creature that comes and stalks the night.
Are there no moth women?
You know what? I have not done that research, but I feel like it's much like with Nessie. There really is only just one of a kind.
But how can these creatures be so long-lived? Or do we assume that there are like families of big feet?
I mean, from
Because they're not supernatural, right?
Yeah.
Like cryptids are different than mythological creatures also in the way that they are natural, they are part of the natural world.
Yeah.
Unless you want to go into like will-o'-the-wisps and, I don't know, like mermaids or something. I'm sure like there are subsets of the cryptid fan base? Just scientific study?
Sure.
Quasi-scientific study? That believe in them too. But it seems like cryptids are rooted in the natural world. Like a plesiosaur like actually existed at some point in history, like 65 million years ago. And that must be what Nessie is. Nessie is not a fire-breathing dragon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think there's multiple theories with it. Some I've heard is just that they have longer lifespans.
No.
And things like with Yetis and Sasquatches,
Sasquatchi?
those of the Sasquatch nature, were like frozen, much like how we're frozen, and then with our changing environment, have come into being.
Okay, so they're like floating around in like a sarcophagus of ice, or like they were flash frozen, and then the climate changed, and then they were unfrozen,
and then continued about their
with
existence.
no brain damage, and right.
Yeah, apparently. And then there are some, and I think there's even been like kids movies, but movies nevertheless, of like that there are races of these, and it's a whole species, and the ones we know are ones that got separated from.
Okay.
So like Nessie is from a whole like species, but then something happened that separated separated them from their family, and then that's like how we got Nessie.
Well, that's really sad.
And there's also there's a Disney short about it.
Okay.
Where the entire Loch Ness was literally just because Nessie got sad and cried and made a lake.
That's very sad.
Because she was alone and lost.
I want to say the lake next to Scargo Tower has that legend, but it goes back to like the Native American tribe that was there. That there was like a chieftain's daughter that wept, and her pool of tears is what formed that small lake or that pond.
Yeah.
I can't speak to the validity of that, on a cultural way, and I certainly can't speak to it on a historical point of view, but that's what I've heard.
Well, yeah, that's the beauty of folklore as well, is that sometimes those stories that have been passed down for generations, whether within a tribe or a culture, or even just when someone's trying to share their culture, those things sometimes get mixed in with these other things.
Right. Well, then it becomes a game of like telephone, where it's like the story changes each time it's told. And if you don't have people writing it down, then things are added to. Of course, the type of people it's being communicated with.
Yes, especially with language translations as well.
Right. It could take on a different meaning because in the context that it's being brought up in the particular people or individuals or families, like it has to take on different meaning to teach a certain lesson.
And that's why I love it, because the same creature can be something different to so many people. And then I warned that I was going to bring it up, but the show Supernatural, they kind of go into that, where when they have these monsters or creatures that they either need to fight or save or whatever it may be, they talk about the lore, and it's so ambiguous a lot of times, where they're like, well, some people think this and some people like that. Like one of my favorite like plot lines of Supernatural, and it's not a spoiler because it's just a little B story, is the Tulpa, which is something that is literally just a story that came to like manifest into actual physical existence because enough people believed it. So things like Slender Man, when people like would talk all about Slender Man over and over again, it became, people were like, no, Slender Man's real, I saw him, like it really happened. And it's like, right. Is that like enough people believed it, so now it's real? Or
that's interesting, right? Yeah, because Slender Man is a completely like manufactured story. Like it originated like on like online fiction, right? And even the person that like wrote it said like, no, I just made this up. But there are people that actually literally believe in Slender Man, whether by the power of belief or thinking that the person that invented it was lying and was actually like relating this actual encounter.
Yeah.
So that's interesting to explore.
And that also could lead to how things like cryptids happened. Is like, that could be the origin stories. Enough people, it started off as like just a legend that someone told, story that someone told, and enough people believed it as time went on, and it became widespread enough that it's like it started to physically manifest, and it became like the blurry, mass in the middle of a lake, or the blurry, hairy man walking through the woods, which could just be a hairy man walking through the woods, for all we know.
It's just a hobo.
Yeah, just a naturalist living their life.
Oh, yeah, that's true. It's a hippie.
Yeah.
It's a particularly tall hippie. Well, also, I think it's interesting to contemplate a kind of surviving memory. Like like the stories we were just talking about, like with a telephone aspect where it changed a little bit, throughout the generations. But I mean, based on something actual that shared the world with us, like say, like an animal that is now extinct. Not dating back to the dinosaurs because hominids weren't around back then, but like huge prehistoric mammals, stories about those. At one point, we shared the earth with another hominid, Gigantopithecus. Maybe stories of the Gigantopithecus became the abominable snowman.
You did it.
Or Sasquatch or Bigfoot, yeah. So that's an interesting thing to consider. Extinct birds with these huge wingspans, like the thunderbird of, I want to say, Mesoamerican mythology?
Or
Central American?
Yeah, I believe it's Central American, because I do know, again, to bring it to Harry Potter, when she developed the Ilvermorny, which is the North American wizarding school. Thunderbird is one of the houses.
That never caught on. I remember that was a thing for like a hot minute where it's like, oh, there's American schools. That's exciting. I wonder what kind of American school that I would be put in if I were a wizard or a witch in America. But then it's like, it never really caught on. We were under the suspicion, I think, that the new movies were going to be about like the American wizarding schools, but they weren't. Well, no, it does take place in America.
Yeah, it does take place in America, and I think that's like why we're all very excited. And then the movie wasn't good, and we're like, never mind. Let's just go back to England. So
I'm not excited for the next movie. Grindelwald was like a chore to get through.
I gave up after the first one, even though because what I wanted was from that film, I thought like this is the introduction, and that subsequent films would be the creatures.
Yeah.
And their backstories and their lore and their everything.
Being that it's based on a dictionary about fantastic beasts.
That's the stuff I like. I like hearing about creatures and where they came from, especially creatures you make either made up or based off of, lore from various cultures.
Sure. Yeah. Right. Yeah, I think what J.K. Rowling did.
Rolling like down a hill.
What J.K. Rowling did was she basically took like creatures from folklore and there's definitely a Tolkien reference, like a Dumbledore in Middle Earth is another name for a bumblebee, so like that's where she got that name from. But no, I don't think she deals with cryptids. Although you could easily say that creatures from the wizarding world might be cryptids to Muggles.
Yeah. And I think that's kind of also, I don't want to give her any more credit, but like that is one of the things that she does a lot is it kind of is that you see more in the books than in the actual films. And it's also the one thing I think that Fantastic Beasts got right, which was how did the non-magical people, like, obviously something crazy happened. There was this big, huge, like, fight where, like, parts of the street go in flying and, like, there's a huge crack in the street. It's like, how did we explain that to ourselves as people who aren't in this world? And it's like, earthquakes,
Yeah, exactly, right. And not everyone's memory can be altered. There has to be some kind of side effect of the wizarding world, like, interfering with our own. Believe it or not, we've reached the end of this entire episode.
We did it.
And I think that went by super quick.
Yeah.
Because cryptids are an amazing topic. I think mythological creatures deserve to have more spoken of them on a future episode of Geeky Port.
Yeah.
Yeah. So anything that you want to say to our viewers before we sign off for tonight?
Be sure to feed your neighborhood cryptid.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Be sure to feed your neighborhood cryptid. So again, I am Jamie, tonight's host for Geeky Port, a safe harbor in the world of geekdom. And we will see you next month for another exciting episode.